A stray dog rescuing a newborn baby. But what a nearby hunter does next will leave you shocked and outraged. The night was harsh and unforgiving, a biting cold settling over the thick blanket of the forest, casting everything in shades of silver and shadow. A newborn lay abandoned, swathed in a ragged blanket that had once been blue, but now wore the tired grey of the forest floor. Her tiny frame shivered, and the air was so still that her weak, fragile cries were the only sounds filling the dark solitude. Nearby, a mother dog prowled the edge of the forest with her young, nose close to the ground, sniffing out a meal. She was a wiry creature, hardened by the wild, yet carrying in her gaze a watchfulness, a caution born from protecting her own vulnerable litter. That night, as she moved with practiced quietude, she heard a noise that didn't belong, soft and faint, yet stirring, a cry too tender, too helpless, to be ignored. She froze, ears perked and attentive, her instinct sharpening. She'd heard the cry of the small and weak many times before, but never one like this. Slowly, she padded forward, sniffing the cold night air, each step calculated, careful, as she homed in on the source of the sound. Her eyes, shining in the dim moonlight, scanned the area until they found the trembling figure wrapped in fabric. She could see the slight quiver of the little body, hear the struggling breaths. Something deep within her stirred. With an almost motherly tenderness, the dog approached and lowered her muzzle, sniffing the child, reading its scent, feeling the warmth of its tiny, beating heart beneath her nose. She lingered there, absorbing its fragility, until something resolute formed in her gaze. Instinct and duty rose within her as she nestled down beside the baby, her body a shield against the cold. She draped herself over the child, surrounding it in her warmth, and listened as the baby's whimpering faded, soothed by the comforting heat. Just then, her own pups, small and curious, appeared beside her, chattering with yips and whines. They were perplexed by the odd bundle of fabric and flesh nestled against their mother. With cautious eyes, the mother dog watched them approach, each step taken with an innocent wonder only young animals possess. She raised her head and barked, a stern warning, each bark clear. "Stay back. Be gentle." Her pups halted, peering up at her with puzzled eyes, knowing well her voice and its command. They sniffed the air, taking in the new scent, their eyes wide as they recognized something vulnerable, something in need of care. The night stretched on as the mother dog stayed, vigilant and unmoving. The forest breathed around them, the leaves rustling with the quiet rhythm of the wind, the distant sounds of nocturnal creatures fading into the background. The pups eventually huddled close to their mother, curling in for warmth, casting their tiny bodies against hers in a shared circle of protection around the child. Every so often, one of the puppies would lift its head, eyes drawn to the strange little figure their mother guarded so fiercely. They would inch forward, sniffing the child, and each time the mother would give a short bark, a soft but firm reminder, her duty clear. She could sense that this child, small and defenseless, had no one else. In the shelter of this maternal watch, the baby slept on, the cold forest now a fortress, softened by the warmth of the mother dog and her loyal, wide-eyed litter. And in the heart of that wild night, a bond was forged, a silent promise from the mother dog to the human child, a vow of protection that the mother dog took upon herself with a quiet, unyielding strength. As the night wore on and the stars shifted overhead, the mother dog remained beside the child, her body wrapped protectively around it, shielding it from the cold that had nearly claimed it. The night was her duty now, and with her pups curled around her, she lay awake, alert, prepared to face anything the forest might bring. As the first pale light of dawn stretched through the dense forest, the mother dog awoke, her eyes meeting the gentle rise and fall of the tiny child's chest. beside her. She felt it, the urge, the silent pull of duty. Her own pups would be stirring soon, hungry and reliant on her warmth, her milk. But here, nestled close against her side, was this other life, a delicate, helpless baby wrapped in a tattered blanket. She felt the weight of her responsibility, torn between her own young and the fragile bundle that had been thrust upon her by fate. A soft whimper escaped the baby's lips, and the mother dog's ears twitched in response. Slowly she stood, her fur bristling slightly against the chill of the morning. She cast a long, worried glance down at the child, hesitant to leave. Her instincts screamed, urging her to stay, to protect, but hunger gnawed at her belly, a reminder that she needed strength to keep her own pups and this newfound child alive. The mother dog moved swiftly, yet silently through the clearing, her paws careful on the dew-damp earth. She nosed around the forest floor, gathering whatever she could find, a fallen branch here, a cluster of leaves there, a few scraps of bark softened by the night's mist. She worked with a quiet intensity, forming a small, sheltered nest around the baby. Each piece she placed was meant to shield, to insulate, to cradle. And finally, she pulled a larger layer of dry leaves over the child, her nose brushing the baby's cheek softly, as if to assure it she would return. But as she turned to go, a small cry burst forth from the tiny body, thin, weak, but insistent. The baby's face scrunched, fists clenched, as it let out a cry of need, a sound of raw, instinctive hunger. The mother dog froze, her heart racing as she looked back. She knew that cry. It was the same sound her own pups made, that desperate plea for nourishment. With an unsteady resolve, she lay down beside the child once more, nudging its tiny head toward her, coaxing it close. It took only a moment for the baby to find what it needed, its mouth instinctively latching onto the mother dog's side, drawing from her the life-sustaining milk meant for her own. A pang of something unnameable struck her heart. But it wasn't regret or reluctance. It was a profound acceptance, a surrender. For in that instant, she felt herself bound to this child by something beyond mere instinct. As the baby fed, its cries quieted, and the small body relaxed, nestling back against the dog's warmth. She stayed there, unmoving, as the first rays of sun glinted through the trees, warming the ground around them. Her mind wandered briefly to her own pups, who by now would be waking and searching for her. Her heart pulled in two directions, but she held steady, waiting until the baby was full, and only then did she rise. Once the baby was snug and asleep in its makeshift nest, the mother dog made her way back to her den. She was swift and purposeful, her path winding through the familiar turns of the forest, until she reached the place where her pups lay huddled together, their soft whimpers rising as she approached. She fed them, her heart easing as she watched them, knowing that for now all her children, born and adopted alike, were safe. But even as she tended to her own, her thoughts strayed to the little bundle she'd left behind. She knew she would return, that she couldn't abandon it, not after feeling its need and sensing the bond that had formed between them. So, as soon as her pups had fed and drifted back to sleep, she retraced her steps, back to the clearing where the baby lay. The mother dog approached cautiously, her ears pricked, eyes scanning for any hint of danger. She settled down beside the child, curling her body protectively around it, the warmth of her fur a buffer against the chill that still clung to the air. Her body remained vigilant, a silent guardian as the baby slept, and her sharp senses stayed alert to any threat that might disrupt this fragile peace. For that morning, in the stillness of the forest, the mother dog held her silent vigil. It was a quiet, steadfast devotion, an unspoken promise etched into the fabric of dawn, a mother's love, fierce and unyielding, even for a child not her own. The night was silent, but for the faint whimpers of a tiny, helpless child nestled under a patchwork of leaves and makeshift bedding. A gentle, weary sigh broke the quiet as the mother dog lay down beside the infant, her eyes reflecting an unspoken promise to guard the frail life before her. The forest was her territory, and her instincts ran as deep as the roots of the ancient trees. To her, this child was not prey, but something precious and vulnerable, worth protecting at all costs. In the dimness, only the flicker of starlight pierced the canopy, casting fleeting shadows across the ground. It was then that an unsettling shift in the air drifted through the clearing, cold and unwelcoming. A low growl rose in the mother dog's throat as her ears pricked to the snapping of twigs nearby, her nose lifting to catch the sour scent. She could feel them, a pack of young wolves, bold yet unsure, moving closer with each cautious step. She knew what drew them here, the same scent of life and vulnerability that had bound her to the child. Only these wolves were driven by a hunger she could never allow to touch the fragile bundle she sheltered. Instinctively, she rose, planting her body firmly between the infant and the encroaching danger. Her stance was low, her eyes blazing with a fierce, primal focus that conveyed a silent warning to the young intruders. "This child is mine to protect," her posture seemed to declare, and her muscles rippled with tension, her hackles raised as she braced herself for what might come. The pups, each still clumsy and young, hesitated as they met her fierce gaze. They, too, had their pack instincts, yet the presence of the mother dog disoriented them. Here was an animal whose demeanor was neither predator nor fearful. Rather, she stood with her mother's fierce love, an energy foreign to the wolves and their untamed hunger. For a moment, a standoff hung thick in the air, each side assessing the other with silent deliberation. Then, from the shadows of the nearby underbrush, her own puppies emerged. They were smaller, even more defenseless, yet their steps were full of determination. The little ones sidled up beside her, filling the space at her flanks as if summoned by some ancient call of loyalty. They may not have been able to understand the danger fully, but they sensed their mother's unease, and their tiny bodies emitted growls and whimpers in unison, a makeshift chorus of defiance. The wolves paused, sniffing the air, puzzled by this unfamiliar force of unity and defiance. They shuffled forward and back in indecision, their eyes flickering between the mother dog and her resolute brood, who stood fast despite their fragile forms. The collective growling, small though it was, rippled through the night, a declaration of protection, of bond, of family. The tension was palpable as the two sides sized each other up in the thickening darkness. And just as suddenly as they had arrived, the young wolves took a step back, and then another, until they turned and slinked away, one by one, their retreat a quiet concession. The mother dog's body relaxed, though her gaze remained vigilant, tracking the wolves until their shadows vanished into the black beyond. Once they were gone, she turned back to the infant, nudging her muzzle close to the child's face, her warm breath falling over the tiny cheeks as she licked gently at the soft skin, a silent reassurance to the child who had no way of understanding. She sniffed the little one, as if double-checking for any harm, and upon finding none, lay down beside the child once more, wrapping herself close. For the rest of the night, she stayed alert, her ears twitching at the slightest noise, her nose to the air. Any flicker of movement, any brush of leaves sent her into a poised readiness. She lay with her head cradled near the infant, her own heartbeat a steady drum of warmth against the baby's side, a lullaby of life in a world of cold. As morning light trickled in through the branches above, the mother dog stirred, raising her head just enough to peer around the quiet clearing. The forest was peaceful again, her small family and the infant safely cocooned by her warmth. She closed her eyes for just a moment longer, basking in the gentle warmth of morning, her heart steady, a silent sentinel, ever devoted to the fragile life entrusted to her care. On the other side of the forest, Lucas kept a steady pace, his rifle slung over his shoulder. The air was sharp, filled with the aroma of pine and damp soil, while each step crunched underfoot, breaking the heavy silence around him. This was his world, a place where the sound of a single twig snapping could mean life or death, a world he knew well. This morning, though, he wasn't quite himself. An unexpected quietude had settled in his mind. He pressed forward, eyes scanning his surroundings, his thoughts on nothing more than his target. The elusive wild dogs rumored to roam these woods. But then, amidst the silence, he saw her, standing, almost hovering, in the dense thicket. A woman, swaying slightly, as if the forest itself was the only thing holding her upright. Her clothes were torn and muddied, her hair disheveled. She looked so out of place, as if she'd stumbled from another world. Lucas felt a ripple of unease settle over him. He moved closer, cautious, every instinct alert, his eyes fixed on her. She didn't notice him until he was almost within arm's reach. Then, with a sudden jolt, she looked up, her wide eyes blank at first, then quickly filling with fear. Lucas asked softly, trying not to startle her any more than she already was. Her gaze flickered, searching his face for something, perhaps reassurance, perhaps a reason to run. Instead, she simply nodded, her mouth parting slightly as if to speak, but no words came. "My name's Lucas," he offered, his voice low and steady. "I can help you, but you'll need to tell me what happened." He noticed the tremor in her hands, the way she clutched her own arms, holding herself together. This wasn't just any kind of loss, he realized. It was the kind of loss you don't come back from easily. She swallowed, her voice barely a whisper. "Kelly," she managed, and her voice cracked on that one small word. She cleared her throat, then her gaze drifted to the ground as if the earth might absorb her pain. I thought he'd changed, but he hadn't." Her voice broke, and she took a breath, then continued, haltingly. "My ex-husband. He didn't just want me. He wanted her, our daughter. I thought if I left, if I kept quiet, he'd just leave us alone." Lucas felt a pang in his chest, a tightening as he imagined the hell she must have endured. "What did he do?" he asked gently, careful not to press too hard. Kelly looked away, her eyes filling with the past, images only she could see. "He found out," she said finally, her words hanging in the air. "When he heard I'd had a baby, he came looking. He showed up, demanded to see her, said she was his, and that he would take her, with or without me. I couldn't risk it. So I ran. I took her and ran into the forest." Her voice grew quieter, fading almost to a whisper. "But I got lost. I left her in a safe spot just for a moment. I was going to find water, and a shiver ran through her, and Lucas could feel her desperation, seeing it in the way she bit her lip, in the way she hugged herself tighter, as if to keep from falling apart. It was dark, and I fell. There was this stream, and I just remember hitting my head, and then nothing. When I woke up, she was gone." Her voice broke, and her shoulders sagged, her strength spent. He felt his chest tighten as her words sunk in. Here was a woman who had lost everything, and yet was still standing, still searching. In that moment, Lucas felt a powerful resolve built within him. He knew he couldn't turn his back on her, not now, not ever. He leaned in closer, his voice a low promise. "We'll find her, Kelly. I swear we'll find her. Just stay with me, all right? We'll keep going until we do." She looked at him, a glimmer of hope breaking through the despair in her eyes, and nodded. Together, they continued deeper into the forest, their journey stretching before them in the fading twilight, carrying the weight of fear and an unspoken bond. Lucas could feel her trust settling onto him, and he was determined not to break it. As they walked, he knew that tonight was not about the hunt or the forest, or even his own life. It was about this promise, and the hope that maybe, just maybe, they would emerge from this darkness with something precious in their arms. The woods held an eerie stillness that seemed to deepen as Lucas and Kelly ventured further, guided only by the waning light that threaded through dense trees. Each step felt like a descent into something almost timeless, like they were moving between worlds rather than simply following a path. Lucas moved ahead, scanning for any signs of the child, but it was Kelly's face that revealed the real toll of this search. Her eyes, darkened by exhaustion and worry, darted from side to side, her breaths heavy with anticipation. Her hand clutched at her chest, gripping the fabric as though it were the only thing keeping her grounded. It was then Lucas spotted a figure, a small, hunched shape half hidden in the foliage. His breath caught, and his hand tightened instinctively around his rifle. But as they drew closer, the shape became clear. A dog, or rather, a dog that was hurt. Lucas approached cautiously, eyes narrowing as he saw the metallic glint of a trap around the creature's leg. A deep, ragged cut where the trap had bitten into flesh had bled down its paw, staining the forest floor. Lucas muttered under his breath, realizing with a pang of guilt that it was one of his own snares. He set down his rifle and knelt beside the animal, hands steady despite the adrenaline that surged within him. The dog, a mother dog, eyed him warily, its eyes a shade of pain and a flicker of instinctive mistrust. But then, perhaps sensing his intention, she relaxed slightly, her body still tense, but no longer recoiling. "Easy now," he murmured, voice low as he released the snare from her leg. Blood flowed freely, and Kelly's gasp barely escaped her as she knelt beside him, holding out a cloth. Lucas took it, binding the wound with a care that surprised even himself, tying it tightly enough to slow the bleeding. As he finished, the mother dog stood, giving her wounded leg a tentative press to the ground. Her gaze shifted from Lucas to Kelly, and then back, gratitude mingling with a strange urgency. With one last look at Lucas, she let out a high-pitched bark and began limping forward, pausing only to look back as if beckoning them to follow. Kelly looked at Lucas, her eyes wide with confusion and an unspoken question. But there was something compelling in the dog's behavior, something that felt like more than a mere whim. She's showing us the way," Kelly whispered, the words escaping her as if they'd sprung from a deep, forgotten place inside her. Lucas hesitated, glancing back at the path they'd left behind, a path back to what was safe, back to solid ground and daylight. But then he turned, following the dog with Kelly close behind. They pushed through the undergrowth, each step taking them deeper, branches clawing at their skin and clothes, the sounds of their own hurried breathing filling the silence that lay like a thick fog around them. The mother dog led them tirelessly, her injured leg barely slowing her as she limped forward with a fierce determination. Now and then she barked, casting her head back to ensure they were still with her, the urgency in her eyes clear. Lucas sensed something primal in her drive, something beyond simple loyalty, something that spoke of a fierce, unyielding love. They reached a clearing, the ground damp and covered with tangled vines and thick brush. In the center of it, a large, dense cluster of bushes shivered as though stirred by a hidden presence. The mother dog's bark took on a frantic tone, each note of it vibrating with both fear and protectiveness. She stopped at the edge of the bushes, head low, her body tense, and let out a low, guttural growl. Lucas raised his rifle, heart pounding in his chest as he aimed at the rustling foliage. His finger hovered over the trigger, eyes narrowed, every muscle in his body wound tight as he prepared to fire. He felt the weight of the moment settle over him, a sense that this was a decision that carried a significance he couldn't quite name. But just as his finger tightened, the dog let out a sharp, almost pleading bark, a sound so piercing it broke through his concentration like a shattering glass. It wasn't a sound of aggression, but a warning, a command even. She planted herself in front of the bush, her body a shield, refusing to let him harm whatever was hidden there. Lucas's grip on the rifle slackened, his mind racing. Kelly's hand found his arm, her grip firm, and he could feel the silent message it conveyed. Wait. As Kelly's frantic shout split through the quiet of the forest, "Lucas, stop!" Her voice quivering with urgency, she dashed toward the patch of tangled shrubs. Her heart pounded, and each step brought fresh waves of fear that welled up into tears as she stumbled through the brush, finally catching sight of something familiar, a tattered blanket, clinging to the last remnants of warmth it held around her baby. Her tiny daughter lay curled in the makeshift nest, surrounded by leaves and the scattered padding of rough foliage. Lucas froze, the cold shock of her words slicing through his intent, his hands falling limp as they hovered near his weapon. An icy sweat began to bead along his brow as he realized, in an awful flood of clarity, the disaster he had nearly set in motion. His gaze followed Kelly's path through the undergrowth, and as she crumpled beside the child, he felt a shiver work through his spine, settling heavy in his bones. Kelly reached the small bundle, her legs giving way as she collapsed to her knees, clutching her daughter close, her hands trembling as she felt the fragile, comforting weight of the child she had feared lost forever. Her voice choked on the words, tears blurring her vision as she buried her face in the baby's thin, matted hair. The tiny girl's face, pale and soft, lay nestled against the worn blanket, encircled by a strange, almost magical assembly, a mother dog and her young ones, steadfastly guarding the precious life within their grasp. Kelly's sobs turned into quiet murmurs of disbelief, her relief too vast to hold in words. The fear, the gut-wrenching worry that had accompanied her flight into the woods, the endless questions that haunted her nights, all dissolved in the raw, unfiltered gratitude she now felt for these creatures, who had stood vigil over her baby with more loyalty than she could ever have dreamed. She whispered brokenly, stroking her daughter's cheeks as she looked to the mother dog, her heart swelling with an unspoken vow to remember this kindness forever. As Lucas drew closer, he halted at the sight before him, a tableau of tenderness and ferocity where the dog, wounded but unyielding, lay beside the child she had protected. The mother dog's eyes held Lucas's, and there was a depth to her gaze, a weary acceptance of the role she'd taken on. Her loyal brood huddled near, whining softly, their small bodies pressed protectively around her. Lucas, stunned, lowered himself beside Kelly and the infant, his remorse weighing heavy. Carefully, he reached for the dog's injured paw, his hands moving with reverence and care as he unwound his first aid kit and began tending to the wound. The realization of what he had nearly done bore down on him like a storm, but as he worked, he spoke softly to the animal, his gratitude woven into his touch. "I owe you," he whispered, almost to himself, his voice barely a breath of the evening air. The puppies, tiny and unafraid, circled closer to their mother, their soft, anxious yips filling the silence, watching him, each noise a signal of their undivided trust and love for her. Lucas glanced at them, moved by the sight, the protective closeness they shared, the devotion that had bound them together, even in their most vulnerable moments. Kelly's tears slowed, and she looked up at Lucas, who, absorbed in his work, seemed utterly transformed. She saw in his eyes a respect she hadn't seen before, as though some inner guard he had always kept up had finally lowered. They exchanged a look of shared understanding, one that spoke of the unexpected connection that bound them to the dog and her pups, a reminder of the fierce, instinctive love that transcended even the divide between species. Kelly took a breath, steadying herself, and spoke softly to Lucas. They saved her. They didn't have to, but they did. Lucas nodded, his hand gently brushing the dog's fur as he finished bandaging her paw, humbled in the presence of the silent resolve that had shielded the child. He whispered to the dog, though his words were just as much for himself as for her. "You're a better protector than I'll ever be." In the gentle hues of dawn, Lucas helped Kelly return to the village, her baby bundled tightly against her, with a resilience softened only by the warmth of her mother's embrace. Alongside, he carried a sense of relief tinged with something deeper, a stirring he hadn't anticipated. That dog, brave and battered, and her litter followed closely, each step a testament to their loyalty, their raw and ferocious devotion to protect a life as fragile as the morning mist. Lucas felt an unfamiliar weight on his shoulders. It wasn't the physical exhaustion, it was something knotted in his chest, a twinge of understanding that perhaps he hadn't known himself as well as he'd thought. Back in the village, as Kelly tended to her baby, Lucas found himself crouching down beside the mother dog, gingerly tending to her wounded leg. The dog eyed him cautiously, her gaze filled with something he could only describe as wise, as if she knew her purpose extended beyond mere survival. He spoke in a low, soothing tone, half expecting her to snap, but she let him work, trusting him enough to allow this tender moment between them. His fingers were gentle, and he marveled at the resilience beneath her battered coat. "Thank you," Kelly whispered as she approached, cradling her daughter close. Her eyes, still glassy with unshed tears, were fixed on the dog and her puppies. She crouched down, her fingers tentatively reaching out to stroke the mother dog's fur. "You didn't just save her," she said, her voice catching. "You gave me back everything I thought I'd lost." The dog's head nudged forward, meeting Kelly's hand in a silent acknowledgement of her gratitude. In that moment, they weren't a woman and a stray dog. They were two mothers, bound by the love and fierce protectiveness they held for their children. Lucas stood back, his heart a mix of conflicting emotions, watching Kelly pour her gratitude into every soft stroke along the dog's fur. It dawned on him then, painfully and beautifully clear, that these animals were more than what he'd ever given them credit for. All his life, hunting had been his sanctuary, his escape. The thrill of tracking, of closing in on his target, had always left him with a sense of accomplishment. But standing there, witnessing this raw exchange of love and understanding, he couldn't help but question everything he thought he'd known. Was hunting truly a sport? Or was it a cruelty, wrapped in a false sense of triumph? He'd once viewed these creatures as threats, obstacles to be conquered, their lives as something insignificant. But today, that belief lay shattered, like fragments of a mirror, each shard reflecting a new, unsettling truth. They had risked themselves, these so-called wild creatures, to guard a human child, proving their worth in ways he could scarcely comprehend. Kelly, looked up at Lucas, sensing his silent turmoil. "Funny, isn't it?" she murmured, her eyes shifting to the mother dog beside her. "Sometimes I think animals know us better than we know ourselves." Her words hung heavy in the air, a truth Lucas couldn't deny. He nodded, swallowing hard as he looked back at the dog and her puppies, feeling a strange but undeniable kinship. In a quiet resolve, Lucas knew he couldn't return to his old ways. He'd always considered himself an honorable hunter, one who respected the code of the wild. But now he saw that respect meant more than he'd ever realized. It was understanding that these lives were intertwined with his own, that they held the same capacity for love, fear, and sacrifice. His hand drifted to his hunting rifle, a familiar weight now feeling foreign, as if it no longer belonged to him. In his mind, he decided it was time to let it go, to retire it, to leave behind the chase for something nobler. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting a warm glow over the village, Lucas stood with Kelly and the mother dog, a quiet bond linking them all. He knew that whatever came next, he would carry this lesson within him, a compass guiding him away from the paths he once walked so blindly. Kelly had been watching the seasons shift, the skies going from a dull grey to the burst of spring colours, and then settling again into the warmth of summer. Each sunrise brought with it a sense of freedom that was still so new, a sensation that sometimes filled her with quiet disbelief. She knew that she and her daughter Emma were finally safe. The news that her ex-husband had been arrested for more violent actions that would keep him behind bars for some time had come as both a relief and a strange kind of closure. Kelly could finally release the worry that had haunted her, one that crept into her mind even in her happiest moment. In the quiet of her new life, Kelly was finding joy in the simple moments with Emma. They spent their mornings together, Emma's laugh filling the small, cozy house they now called home. The love between them grew deeper, stronger, becoming a bond that only those who had survived something together could understand. They were no longer haunted. Instead, they were present, wholly and deeply. Kelly could look into her daughter's eyes and feel the warmth of a future that she had once doubted would ever come. Lucas, who had stayed close in his quiet, watchful way, would often visit, bringing with him the mother dog and her puppies. It had started as a casual gesture. Lucas, with a soft grin, would appear with the loyal animals trailing behind him. Over time, though, the visits had grown into something cherished, a ritual that connected all of them. Emma adored the dogs, especially the mother who had once saved her. Kelly could see the way Emma's small hands would reach out to stroke the dogs with gentleness, as though she knew they had been her protectors, her silent guardians in the wilderness when no one else could be there. "Lucas," Kelly once said softly, almost without realizing she'd spoken his name aloud. She'd been watching him across the room as he sat by the fire, his gaze distant, yet calm. When he looked up, she could see the light flickering in his eyes, a reminder of all they'd been through, a shared history of quiet strength. Lucas gave her a small, reassuring smile. "It's good to see you both like this," he said, his voice low and steady. "The way things should be." Kelly nodded, feeling a warmth spread in her chest that she couldn't quite name. It was a feeling of safety, of comfort, and maybe even hope. And as Emma grew, Kelly would sometimes share the story with her, always in the gentlest terms. She would tell her daughter about the night in the forest, about the dogs who had circled her, keeping her warm and safe under the stars. And in Emma's wide eyes, Kelly would see understanding blossoming, a glimpse of the resilient spirit that she'd somehow inherited from her mother, and perhaps even from Lucas. Their story began to take on a life of its own, one that seemed to reach the people around them. Friends, neighbors, and even strangers who heard their tale would look at Kelly and Emma with a kind of respect, a silent acknowledgement of the strength it had taken to survive and find peace. Lucas, too, had changed. He had put aside his hunting and instead devoted himself to caring for the dogs, treating them with the same reverence he showed to Kelly and Emma. In a way, they had all found redemption, a gentle transformation that only life's trials could bring. As Kelly tucked Emma into bed each night, she whispered stories of the world they had built together, one rooted in kindness, strength, and an unwavering faith in the goodness around them. They were no longer bound by fear, but united by love. Love for each other, for Lucas, and for the animals who had saved them. In that little home, as night settled and the stars blinked into existence, Kelly knew that their past was now just a story. A precious one, yes, but a story. Their lives had been given back to them, washed clean by the simple beauty of second chances. Wow, what an incredible journey of love, resilience, and second chances. Kelly and Emma's story reminds us all that even in the darkest times, kindness and courage can light the way. And Lucas's transformation shows how life's challenges can change us in the best ways, bringing us closer to what truly matters. If this story touched your heart like it did ours, don't forget to give this video a thumbs up and subscribe for more inspiring tales like this. And let us know in the comments, what part of this story moved you the most? Was it Kelly's determination, Emma's innocence, or the loyalty of those amazing dogs? Thanks for watching, and remember, no matter how tough things get, there's always hope. And sometimes, the most beautiful friendships come from the most unexpected places. See you in the next video.